The atmosphere in London on the morning of May 31st, 2026, felt unseasonably tense as dozens of international journalists and television crews gathered outside the historic gates of Buckingham Palace. Most spectators expected a routine press briefing or a minor administrative announcement, but what unfolded was a highly calculated and unprecedented masterstroke that would permanently alter the power dynamics within the British royal family. When Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stepped out of her vehicle, the immediate realization hit the press pool that she was entirely on her own. There was no King Charles beside her to offer sovereign validation, no Prince William standing guard, and no wall of senior palace advisors managing her movements. She walked toward the microphone array with absolute poise and an undeniable aura of independence, sending a clear message to the world that she was acting under her own authority. When she began to speak, her words carried a weight that completely transcended standard royal rhetoric. She stated firmly that the crown only holds value when it represents absolute transparency, announcing that effective at midnight, the entire royal charitable system would be subjected to an exhaustive, independent forensic audit. She made it explicitly clear that any undocumented or untraceable funds discovered during this process would be frozen immediately, concluding with the chilling phrase that they do not protect mistakes in the dark, but rather bring them into the light. To a casual viewer tuning into mainstream media coverage, this sounded like a progressive step toward financial modernization and administrative accountability. However, behind the closed doors of the palace, this public statement was a devastating legal maneuver designed to immobilize the specific financial network that Queen Camilla had spent decades establishing. By utilizing live international television as her platform, Catherine ensured that the protocol could not be quietly dismantled or covered up by internal factions, effectively establishing her dominance before millions of witnesses worldwide. While the public was still absorbing the shockwaves of Catherine's solo press conference, a parallel operation was already unfolding 70 miles away at the secluded Ray Mill estate in Wiltshire, where Queen Camilla was staying. By mid-morning, the entire property had been placed into an absolute communications lockdown, with all staff movements suspended and standard channels of external contact severed. A single unmarked vehicle breached the estate gates, carrying a top-tier legal advisor representing Prince William. Inside the advisor's secure briefcase lay a binding, non-negotiable document that palace insiders have since referred to as the silent contract. This was not a polite request for Camilla to gracefully scale back her royal patronages, but a brutal legal ultimatum that offered zero room for compromise or discussion. The terms outlined in the document were astonishingly restrictive, demanding that Camilla completely forfeit her right to speak or act in any official capacity without prior administrative approval. Under these new guidelines, every single public statement, piece of correspondence, and media interaction would have to be vetted and cleared by Catherine's personal communications team first. In a single stroke, the expansive network of journalists, charitable alliances, and influential figures that Camilla had methodically cultivated over the last 30 years was to be completely dismantled, reducing her to a purely ceremonial figurehead stripped of any actual operational leverage. The immediate question that arises from this confrontation is how a princess could possess the immense leverage required to force a sitting queen consort into absolute submission, especially when Camilla technically outranks Catherine in the traditional royal hierarchy. The answer lies in an incredibly precise financial figure uncovered by a specialized team of forensic accountants who had been quietly reviewing the inner workings of the charitable foundations tied to the Duchy of Cornwall. Investigators discovered a highly sophisticated and hidden financial loop involving $12,450,000. On paper, the system operated through routine administrative grants approved for standard operational costs within the charity. However, instead of reaching the intended public beneficiaries, these massive funds were systematically redirected into a secondary, unlisted intermediary trust. From that hidden account, the money was carefully dispersed among a private network of independent organizations and alliances exclusively loyal to Camilla, effectively funding her personal public relations campaigns, securing strategic loyalty, and expanding her private sphere of influence completely outside the bounds of standard palace oversight. When the paper trail was finally decoded, the legal evidence was completely airtight. This comprehensive dossier was precisely what Prince William's legal representative placed on the table at Ray Mill that morning, presenting Camilla with a stark, terrifying choice. She could sign the restrictive contract and retain her grand royal title while losing all actual power, or she could refuse and watch the entire audit dossier be handed over directly to external regulatory authorities under the strict terms of the United Kingdom Charities Act of 2011. Because the deliberate misdirection of charitable trust funds is treated as a severe criminal offense rather than a mere reputational issue, a public investigation would have forced the palace to distance itself entirely, leaving Camilla exposed to devastating legal prosecution and global public disgrace. The trap was perfectly constructed, and the clock was ticking toward an inescapable conclusion. The silence emanating from the private apartments of King Charles during this period of administrative upheaval was perhaps the most unsettling element for the traditionalist faction of the royal household, as it signaled a profound shift in the sovereign's reliance on his immediate heir and daughter-in-law. While the world watched the public breakdown of the old guard, the secondary phase of Catherine's strategic reorganization began to penetrate the most guarded layers of the palace infrastructure, specifically targeting the digital and physical archives of the Duchy of Lancaster. It was here that the forensic team discovered that the $12 million discrepancy was merely the tip of a much larger, more complex iceberg of shadow operations designed to bypass the sovereign's direct oversight. As the audit deepened, investigators uncovered a series of high-level non-disclosure agreements that had been issued to former staff members who had witnessed irregular financial transfers over the last decade. These individuals, many of whom had been forced into early retirement or lateral transfers to obscure departments, were suddenly offered legal immunity by Prince William's office in exchange for full cooperation. The testimonies that emerged painted a picture of a parallel palace administration, one where influence was traded like currency, and where the traditional lines of royal succession were being undermined by a calculated web of alliances. Catherine, functioning with the precision of a seasoned chief executive, utilized this information not for immediate public scandal, but to systematically replace every key figure in the palace hierarchy who had prioritized loyalty to the old system over the transparency of the new regime. This was an invisible coup, executed through legal mandates and human resource restructuring, ensuring that by the time the public became aware of the change, the resistance had already been stripped of its operational capacity. The most explosive revelation, however, emerged when the forensic trail crossed the Atlantic, leading directly to a series of shell companies registered in Delaware with connections to the affluent enclave of Montecito, California. For years, the public narrative had been defined by a bitter, visible feud between the Waleses and the Sussexes, but the audit uncovered a far more nuanced and dangerous reality. It appeared that while the public was distracted by tabloid headlines and televised interviews, a back-channel financial bridge had been established between Queen Camilla's inner circle and certain intermediaries connected to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. This was not a gesture of family reconciliation, but rather a strategic insurance policy. The documents suggested that significant sums of money, disguised as charitable consultancy fees, had been funneled toward entities that provided high-level public relations support for the Sussexes. In return, the Sussexes' media narrative often focused its most intense criticism on Prince William and King Charles, while noticeably softening its approach toward Camilla. This realization was the ultimate betrayal for William, who now saw that the internal instability of the monarchy had been actively fueled by a member of its own leadership to maintain a favorable personal image at the expense of the institution's long-term stability. When Catherine presented this evidence to the king in a private meeting at Sandringham, the king's legendary resolve reportedly shattered. He realized that the woman he had fought so hard to place on the throne beside him had been playing a double game that threatened to burn down the very house he had spent his life trying to preserve. This was the moment the king officially signed off on the total transfer of domestic administrative power to William and Catherine, effectively becoming a sovereign in name only while his children took over the actual governance of the firm. As the second week of the takeover progressed, the physical landscape of the palace began to reflect the new reality. The The private offices once occupied by Camilla's most trusted advisors were cleared out overnight, replaced by a new generation of professionals who viewed the monarchy as a corporate entity requiring absolute fiscal discipline. Catherine introduced a new digital tracking system for all royal expenditures, a move that was publicly marketed as an environmental and efficiency initiative, but was in reality a sophisticated surveillance tool designed to prevent the re-emergence of shadow accounts. Every bouquet of flowers, every private charter flight, and every renovation cost was now subject to a 3-tier approval process that ended with Catherine's personal office. The power shift was so absolute that even the most senior courtiers, men who had served under Queen Elizabeth for 40 years, found themselves having to submit formal requests just to access historical records. This level of control was unprecedented in the history of the House of Windsor. It created a climate of hyper-efficiency, but also one of intense paranoia among the remaining staff who still harbored secret sympathies for the former Queen consort. To counteract this, Catherine initiated a series of town hall meetings for palace employees, emphasizing a new culture of transparency and meritocracy. She was building a new royal guard, not of soldiers, but of loyalists who owed their careers entirely to her and William, effectively creating an impenetrable fortress around the future of the monarchy. While the internal restructuring was nearing completion, the problem of the Ray Mill estate remained a delicate issue. Camilla was still legally the Queen consort, and any public move to officially strip her of that title would trigger a constitutional crisis that could potentially lead to calls for a republic. Catherine and William knew they had to maintain the illusion of a united front while ensuring that the reality was anything but. They began to implement a strategy of strategic isolation, often referred to in diplomatic circles as the Gilded Cage. Camilla was encouraged to spend more time at her private estates for health reasons, a narrative that the palace communications team pushed with increasing frequency to the international press. Meanwhile, her access to the king was carefully monitored, and her ability to influence his decisions was reduced to zero. Every time a major state event was planned, Camilla's name would mysteriously appear further down the guest list, or her attendance would be cancelled at the last minute due to minor medical concerns. This was a slow, methodical erasure of a public figure, a process that was as brutal as it was quiet. The message to the rest of the world was clear. The era of backroom deals and shadow influence was over, and the new Princess of Wales was now the true architect of the royal future. By the end of this second phase, the psychological toll on those involved began to manifest in subtle ways. Prince William, usually known for his controlled demeanor, appeared more somber and determined in public, carrying the weight of a son who had essentially had to prosecute his own father's wife. Catherine, on the other hand, seemed to grow more radiant and commanding with each passing day, her fashion choices reflecting a sharper, more structured aesthetic that mirrored her new administrative role. She was no longer just the wife of the heir, she was the de facto regent of the household. However, the most chilling aspect of the entire operation was the absolute silence of the Sussexes in California. As their secret financial lifeline was severed by the audit, the expected retaliatory strike from Montecito did not materialize. This silence suggested that they were either paralyzed by the exposure of their financial ties to Camilla or were waiting for a more opportune moment to strike back. Catherine remained vigilant, knowing that in the world of high-stakes power, a cornered opponent is often the most dangerous. She directed her team to begin a secret contingency plan for a full-scale legal separation of the royal family's private wealth from any remaining overseas interests, a move that would effectively cut the Sussexes off from the British economy forever. The stage was now set for the final confrontation, a move that would either solidify the Wales's position for the next century or risk the total collapse of the royal institution as they knew it. The dawn of the final phase of this historic institutional shift brought with it a cold clarity that reshaped the British monarchy from its very foundations, cementing a new order where traditional sentiments were permanently replaced by absolute strategic survival. Inside the heavily guarded walls of Kensington Palace, the operational center running the forensic audit had successfully completed its domestic sweep, having effectively cut off every single local financial capillary that Queen Camilla had utilized to maintain her quiet grip on power. However, The multi-million-dollar trace leading toward the Sussex Trust in Montecito, California, remained an active explosive device buried beneath the surface of the royal family's carefully curated public presentation. Catherine, now functioning with the absolute authority of a de facto leader, understood that a defensive posture would only invite a calculated counterstrike from across the Atlantic, meaning that the only way to guarantee the long-term stability of the crown was to neutralize the threat before it could be weaponized by external forces. She initiated a highly classified diplomatic protocol, bypassing standard palace channels and reaching out directly to international financial regulators and compliance authorities in the United States, utilizing the rigorous frameworks of global anti-money laundering statutes to force a disclosure of the exact destination of the redirected $12 million. This was a high-stakes chess move that signaled to the occupants of the Montecito estate that any attempt to release the financial documents to the global media would instantly trigger a federal investigation into the structural integrity of their own charitable entities, effectively turning their ultimate leverage into an immediate legal liability that could permanently destroy their remaining global credibility. As the financial net closed in globally, the domestic reality for Camilla at the Ray Mill estate became one of absolute, undeniable finality, marking the end of a 30-year campaign for public acceptance and institutional dominance within the House of Windsor. The official royal bulletins continued to maintain the polished narrative of a supportive queen consort temporarily stepping back due to unforeseen health complications, but behind the heavily monitored security gates, her isolation was total and complete. The silent contract she had signed was being enforced with bureaucratic precision, ensuring that she could not make a single telephone call, send an encrypted message, or receive a private visitor without the explicit, written clearance of Catherine's communications department. Her personal staff, individuals who had served her with fierce loyalty through the most turbulent decades of her life, were systematically reassigned to distant, administrative roles within the wider royal estates, effectively leaving her alone in a massive, silent house surrounded by security personnel whose primary directive was to monitor her confinement. The psychological weight of this transition was profound, representing a complete reversal of fortune for a woman who had successfully navigated the intense scrutiny of the British press and internal palace warfare only to be completely outmaneuvered by a younger generation that refused to play by the outdated rules of courtly diplomacy. She had survival in name only. A living ghost within the structure, she had sacrificed everything to conquer, existing as a sharp reminder to anyone within the palace walls of the immense cost of challenging the new administrative order. Simultaneously, the public presentation of the monarchy underwent a radical, highly calculated transformation under Catherine's direct guidance, shifting the institution away from the ancient, mystified aura of hereditary privilege toward a streamlined model of modern executive governance. When King Charles appeared publicly for the opening of a state facility in early June, the visual staging of the event communicated a powerful, unspoken narrative that the global press pool immediately picked up on. There was no empty chair left beside him to symbolize the absence of his wife, nor was there any mention of her condition in his official remarks. Instead, he was flanked directly by Prince William and Princess Catherine, presenting a unified, three-cornered power structure that radiated stability, continuity, and absolute control. The mainstream media, thoroughly managed by Catherine's reinforced press office, focused its coverage entirely on the king's resilience and the progressive leadership of the younger royals, effectively training the public mind to accept the permanent erasure of Camilla from the institutional landscape without asking uncomfortable questions. This was the true genius of the operation, achieved not through a dramatic public trial or a messy constitutional crisis, but through the quiet, relentless application of media optics and administrative discipline, proving that in the modern era, real power belongs not to those who wear the crown, but to those who control the narrative surrounding it. The long-term implications of this invisible takeover began to settle over the British political establishment, with senior government officials quietly acknowledging that the internal dynamics of the state had shifted permanently toward Kensington Palace. The annual review of the sovereign grant, which had historically been a source of intense debate and potential embarrassment for the royal household, was managed with an unprecedented level of financial transparency that left critics of the monarchy completely without ammunition. Catherine's newly implemented digital tracking system had successfully eliminated every single shadow account and discretionary fund, forcing the wider family to live within strict, auditable parameters that mirrored the corporate governance of a multinational conglomerate. This structural discipline achieved what decades of political pressure could not, effectively neutralizing the growing Republican movement in the United Kingdom by demonstrating that the modern crown was the most efficient, transparent, and accountable branch of the state infrastructure. The flag of the Princess of Wales, which had been raised over Kensington Palace at the conclusion of that fateful first day, remained a permanent symbol of this new reality, a quiet indicator that the future of the British state was being securely engineered by a woman who had entered the family as an outsider and emerged as its ultimate protector. As the final weeks of the summer of 2026 approached, the silence from California remained unbroken, confirming that Catherine's cross-border legal maneuver had successfully established a permanent stalemate between the two opposing factions of the family. The $12 million remained frozen within the complex web of offshore accounts, a massive sum of capital that neither side could safely touch or acknowledge without triggering an international regulatory catastrophe that would destroy them both. This silent resolution was the ultimate victory for William and Catherine, who had not only cleansed the domestic household of its internal corruption but had also built an impenetrable financial wall around the future reigns of themselves and their children. The British monarchy had survived yet another historic crisis, emerging from the shadows of a potentially devastating financial scandal not weakened, but profoundly reinforced, having traded the fragile alliances of the past for the cold, unyielding certainty of modern administrative power. The loop was finally completely sealed, leaving the global audience to look upon a stable, united institution, completely unaware of the invisible, brilliant warfare that had permanently changed the destiny of the crown behind the closed doors of the palace.